Antipode, as we know, is a radical journal of geography. The first issue of Antipode was published in 1969 and held in it the promise and the temper of the 1960s, with the he of geography clearly stated and his racialized location unspeakably white. The first pages of Antipode read, "We are soliciting articles for a journal that in future issues may damn articles and journals alike. For the moment, traditional communication media are being used for the dissemination of non-traditional ideas. Our goal is radical change." Following the first issue, Antipode has continued to disseminate and promise radical work. The journal has published a wide range of articles and meaningful debates about inequity, justice, neoliberalism, and the left. These conversations have not been easy or transparent or singular. Rather, they have been full of contradictions, hopes, and shortcomings. With these contradictions, hopes, shortcomings, and promises in mind, and with our eyes on the first issue of Antipode, I return to the 1960s to draw attention to the significantly anti-imperialist stance that emerged on many of the first pages of the journal. This stance, while certainly not perfect, provides a way to think about how, in the present, we might continue to foster and publish radical intellectual scholarship and debate. The 1960s was not, to be clear, a moment of complete liberation. It was, however, a moment of struggle that allowed some marginalized groups to imagine what it means to be human, and in some cases die for a redefined humanity. It is this reimagination, both good and bad, that I want to underscore, as well as our collective acknowledgement that those struggles over what it means to be human are ongoing. This also means that liberation is incomplete, and that many are still dying to redefine what it means to be human. With the limitations of the first issue clearly in view, the normative white male geographer figure clearly in view too, I do not seek to rewrite and celebrate Antipode's history, but rather ask that we collectively continue as intellectuals to foster radical, anti-colonial intellectual work in the present, as well as continually questioning and contesting what radical geographic thought means. This is, I think, Antipode's best side, not a knowing or pleasant or easy intellectual story, but rather one that is contested and unpleasant and hard. With that, I'm delighted to introduce our 2014 speaker. Rinaldo Walcott is Associate Professor in Humanities, Social Science, and Social Justice Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at University of Toronto. He also works in the graduate program in Women and Gender Studies, as well as the graduate program in Cinema Studies at University of Toronto. From 2002 to 2007, Rinaldo held the Canada Research Chair of Social Justice and Cultural Studies. Rinaldo Walcott is the author of Black Like Who, Writing Black Canada. He is also the editor of Rude, Contemporary Black Canadian Cultural Criticism. He co-edited with Roy Moodley, Counseling Across and Beyond Cultures, exploring the work of Clement Ventros in clinical practice. His forthcoming book, Black Diaspora Faggotry, Readings, Frames, Limits, will be published by Duke University Press. In addition, his work can be found in Small Acts, Palimpsest, Canadian Review of American Studies and Cultural Studies, as well as a number of other places. His teaching and research is interdisciplinary and focuses on Black diaspora cultural studies and post-colonial studies, with an emphasis on questions of sexuality, gender, nation, citizenship, and multiculturalism. While Rinaldo's work attends to a wide range of topics, from music and literatures to pedagogy and race and representation, the consistent theme across all of his articles, essays, and books is how the figure of the human is linked to the racial economy of premature death and Black narrative. Working with and extending the research of thinkers such as Stuart Hall, Sylvia Wynter, Edward Glissant, Audre Lorde, and Jacques Derrida, Rinaldo allows us to think about how the history of plantation slavery, capitalism, and colonialism together provided the conditions through which a new figure of humanity emerged. He draws attention to how the science of modernity classified and differentiated human bodies according to racial, gendered, and economic markers, yet also simultaneously entangled the lives of global subjects. In his work, the heavy weight of classification is noted, yet is reoriented to underscore how the racial project of modernity and sites of violence such as the Middle Passage, the Reserve, the Plantation, produced human intimacies and encounters that undermine the logic of racial differentiation. Within and across these activities, intimacies, and encounters, however, are narratives of Blackness and Black life. and Black human subjects that continue to be identified and sorted through scripts of biological determinism and its attendant racial economies that normalize Black dispossession. Black subjects continue to be marginalized, and as so many practical human actions reveal, Black subjects continue to be put to death. Rinaldo's research thinks across these complex and contradictory workings of modernity, race, violence, and location. In paying close attention to the common sense disposability of Black and other marginalized peoples, he opens up how the figure who has never been identified as human at all, the Black, is in fact implicated in our contemporary attachment to a mode of humanness that can only replicate old classificatory racial scripts, yet at the same time provides meaningful ways to grasp and live with what Frantz Fanon called a new humanism. Rinaldo's talk, Zones of Black Death, Institutions, Knowledges, and States of Being, will take us these places and more. So please join me in welcoming our Antipode speaker for 2014.
Oh boy, there it goes. Let me begin by thanking Dr. McKittrick for the lovely introduction. Catherine and I go way back. She's not only a colleague, but a good friend, so thank you, Catherine. I also want to thank the Antipode Foundation and Antipode Collective and Wiley for inviting me to give this talk, and particularly Andy Kent, who made all of the arrangements for me to get here. It's an honor to be asked to give this talk, and I want to thank all of you in advance for coming out to this lecture. This is a kind of odd talk, because I'm not a geographer. I feel like I needed to declare that. And it's got three sections. This first section is called Institutions, and the second section is called Knowledge, and the knowledge is about Black diaspora studies, and it's a kind of defense of Black diaspora studies, but I hope with a kind of twist. And the last session is called States of Being. So I'm going to get right into this rather odd talk. We have arrived in a node in the zone of Black Death, Florida. That is to say, we have arrived in a zone where Black life forms must persist despite or in spite of the sharp contours which continually seek to make Black life forms not thrive and exist. I use the term Black life forms because Euro-American definitions and practices of the human offer Black life no space within the terrain of human conceptuality or actuality. Black life forms were and are forced to make this zone a residence, and their presence mark the significant residuals of all that have come to constitute what we call the human, with Black life forms standing as the human's antagonist and therefore its hindrance. Black life forms remind, to put it mildly, that modernity's claims of the perfection of human life is impossible, but nonetheless is premised on the singular role of the Black, that of death, indeed, to die violently. The zone of the Americas is a zone of and for the production of Black death. To state the obvious, my insistence on death is not to suggest that Black life does not happen, but rather I want to insist on death as the means towards Black life. Indeed, the discovery of the Americas, and yes, I did say discovery, inaugurates a relation to Black non-humanness of which we still live in the present. But what such means is that Black life forms allow us to see other ways of being human and thus living, and that is and remains a significant challenge to Euro-American partial forms of life. This paper therefore tracks the ways in which Black life persists in the midst of practices, institutions, and knowledges meant to extinguish such life. The paper takes the geographies of the Americas as one zone in which Black death is the foundation upon which institutions, modes of being, and other forms of life stake their claims on the world. In other words, as the paper suggests, the Black death is a precondition for the common sense and being of contemporary life. The paper reflects on Black death by drawing on the scholarship of Sylvia Wynter and a range of Black radical thinkers whose intellectual project has been one of mapping the contours of Black resistance to premature death as a mode of remaking what it means to be human. Indeed, transatlantic slavery, and more so the Middle Passage, as roots for the invention of blackness, its birth through death, the central motif of black life. Death is a primal constituting element of black life forms. In an essay written in the aftermath of the Rodney King verdict, Sylvia Wynter reminds us that the LAPD had a language code which was termed NHI when black suspects were encountered. NHI stood as the acronym for No Humans Involved. Such a term places the relationship between institution and knowledge as central to mapping the ongoing disposability and eviction of black life forms from the category of the human. What is important about Wynter's recalling of NHI is the manner in which language works to narratively condemn the black, but also to suggest black atavism and therefore a lack of being human, as if the category human itself is not a culturally regulating category, with therefore the potential for change and revision. It is precisely because the human as a category is open to revision that Wynter is able to ask us to engage the university as a site to, quote, call for a new intellectual order of knowledge that was initially made in the wake of the civil rights movement, end quote, to institute what she calls a new truth. She then continues to say, concerning the black subject, the no human involved, as a command to those of us in the university generating forms of knowledge, she says, we must now undo the narratively condemned status of those marked as not human, meaning the black. So deeply influenced by Wynter, I suggest that the very institutionality of the Americas is a region of death for black life forms. It is a region of death inaugurated by the modes of European accumulation that it first makes it legible to them as a source for their own renewal and future possibilities. In so doing, land, metals, crops all come to mark the region through the logic of economics as a zone of black terror and death, and as a zone for the ongoing assault and continuous war on Aboriginal peoples. The claim that I am staking here for the Americas as an institutionality of terror and death is my attempt to position a counter-response as one that can only be understood as its very undoing. That is, a decolonial struggle and possible future. The plantation is in many ways the single most important aspect of the zoning of black death, and one might plausibly argue that all forms of black terror and death lead us back to the plantation and its afterlife as the institutionality of all life and death in the Americas. Catherine McKittrick in Plantation Futures helps us to see the wide-ranging institutionality of the plantation by coding or zoning it as both space and time. McKittrick's incisive critique of the ways in which plantation logics frame the past and present is an acute reading of the ways in which it operates as the site of and for, quote, interlocking workings of modernity and blackness. McKittrick writes, and I quote, thus in agriculture, banking and mining, in trade and tourism, and across other colonial and post-colonial spaces, the prison, the city, the resort, these kinds of spaces that we're in, a plantation logic characteristic of, but not identical to, slavery emerges in the present, both ideologically and materially. Indeed, what Wynter's insights cue me to is the time of black death in a zone institutionalized not to give it life, but to extinguish life from it as the force of others' possibilities. In this sense, black life is a challenge to normative forms of value, especially those forms of value rooted in and routed through European Enlightenment and modernist ideals, most evident in economic and bodily value. The plantation, as the central institutionality of the zone of black death, is therefore a node in a larger and more dynamic production of black life. The instantiation of black life forms that defy the attempt to render the laboring commodity of the slave a thing only valuable in relation to European use value, offer us other modes of being human in this zone. Indeed, much of what we have come to call black culture is a mode of living life within, against, and beyond plantation logics, which seek to thingify black life forms. Value and black life are crucial to the institutional foundationality that frames the death zone of the Americas. Furthermore, it is my argument that the available evidence supports the idea that Black people cannot escape this zone of death once they enter it. McKittrick's Plantation Futures provides us a foundational narrative to agilely think this zone as a death-dealing zone. But importantly, her argument also asks us to consider the residue of the plantation as central to the formation of its afterlife, and thus as a significant and recurring element of contemporary life. The plantation never disappears. It proliferates. It is precisely by taking the insights of McKittrick elsewhere that Black death extends into other modes of occurrence, like, for example, diabetes, hypertension, and even things like the extreme occurrence of fryboys and hysterectomies for Black women. Plantation life in and of itself has produced a changed dynamic in the invention of the Black. It is such evidence that it is such evidence that is the ways in which bodily health distinguishes the Black from even the African that demonstrates how the zone of the Americas invented new beings or life forms called Black. Indeed, when contemporary Africans enter this zone, they become Black and susceptible to these same conditions. Furthermore, the institution of medicine and its very foundations, from gynecology to infectious diseases, have been executed on the bodies of Black life forms. Death, thus, is so central to Blackness that it exists as the source or site to give or extend those marked as human their lives. It is precisely because Black life dies that your American life is possible. Last but not least in the institution is the institution of childhood. Indeed, the slave child was not a child and therefore had no childhood as such. Therefore, the institutionality of childhood is a practice and a knowledge that is always launched against Black youthful life forms. By this I mean, and we have witnessed this in our contemporary moment, that Black children are perceived as adult-like and therefore rendered and treated in like fashion. What is particularly crucial is the inability for Black children to be children means that all kinds of post-Enlightenment modernist institutions, practices, and knowledges can only apprehend them as antagonistic to those institutions and knowledges, and thus respond in such kind. These sites of antagonism become the basis for Black death. It is precisely because the slave and the afterlife of slavery does not bring Black life forms into the category of the human that Black youthfulness can only be but understood as a problem to be extinguished. Following Wynter, I understand the work of the scholar to be a part of a political project in which we reorient ideas or knowledge to slip out of this yoke of Euro-American partial views of the world as the only view of the world. To do so, I turn to the scene of Black diaspora studies to think the foundations of this dynamic further and to continually unravel its logics and illogics of maiming and death. So Black diaspora is a concise conceptual and political term, allows us to begin to appreciate the enormity of the dispersal of those now known as Africans or Black at a moment in European expansion and the tragic and complicated legacy of their brutal dispersal. But the Black diaspora studies does not begin and end there. The dispersal is in part set in motion by the genocide and near genocide of the Aboriginal populations in the Americas, and has inaugurated the longest continual colonial resistance in human history. Any Black diaspora studies that does not take seriously the genocide and near genocide of indigenous populations or Aboriginal populations in the Americas, alongside the commencement of African transatlantic slavery, is in my view a diaspora studies not worth having at all. At the same time, any conceptual and discursive renderings of settler colonialism that does not seriously grapple with the far-reaching brutality of the invention of Black beings and Black life forms is also a politics not worth having. Thus my ideas, queued up by Wynter's numerous essays on the European invention and proliferation of a new world, that the European Enlightenment expansion ushered in for all of us, is central to what I'm about to try to accomplish here. Central to the idea of the New World is, I believe, an understanding of the geopolitics of economy and the geopolitics of modernity's imaginary space that has followed in the wake of Europe's expansion into worlds it previously had not known. For those worlds we have come to call in such fashion the Americas. Can't hear me?
I've just been asked to turn up the mic
Okay.
for the people in the back. So apologize.
Yeah,
Sorry
go
about
ahead.
that. I don't know how to do it.
We don't know how to do it. And remember, there should be a button there that says volume.
Just keep going.
Okay, or maybe, can you hear me better now? Okay, I'll try to speak into the mic. Maybe I'm not speaking into the mic enough. Okay, so part of the story here is how discourses of coloniality have come to even mark the ways in which we have dealt with these conceptual and material terms, so that terms like diaspora can sometimes come to conceal crucial and important links and context for the materiality that diaspora also seeks to capture in its conceptual and political range. In this instance, the disappearance of Aboriginal peoples from the diaspora conversation is a case in point. That's bothering me now. Okay, maybe we'll get some help. Okay. Partially understanding slavery in relation to Aboriginal genocide and ongoing colonization means that more is made at stake in the conception of diaspora that I attempt to work with. Part of the more that is at stake is a radical engagement with the category of the human, and thus with an order of knowledge and worldview that is complicated by the creative conditions of a Black discrepant modernity, producing the Americas from the myriad encounters of worldviews brutally cohering together in contradiction and mutuality to produce different people continually since 1492. Indeed, the politically contentious phrase New World does hold a negative and positive possibility and potentiality. Thus, transatlantic slavery is more than a political economy phenomena or a history of early capitalist accumulation. It's a seismic human cultural shift in economy, thought, culture, and thus in human alterability. Transatlantic slavery, along with the brutal theft of Aboriginal territories, is the engine which has driven capitalism and its various global incarnations for the last 500 plus years, as well as European and global thought. Such a claim, I think, is immediately evident to most. However, its deployment always seems to lodge the story only at the juncture of political economy, as though that is the beginning and the end. Instead, we need to think about transatlantic slavery and Aboriginal colonization as a cultural revolution which is still unfolding in ways that remain deeply traumatic, but that are now also complicatedly implicating and entangling, which makes the pinpointing of victims and victimizers much more difficult to demarcate. Recognizing the complications and the intervention of history, as the late Stuart Hall puts it, can help us to better work with the still unfolding impact of Aboriginal colonization and transatlantic slavery. So following Wynter, we might understand 1492 and transatlantic slavery as ushering in new forms of human and social life in which the European comes to name and order the world on the terms of their cosmopolitical, religio-social worldview, or more plainly, European cultural formations of their knowledge systems. Thus, in my view, Black diaspora studies is implicated in both the unraveling of this new worldview, which, as Walter Mignolo states, involves, quote, the control of money and the control of meaning and being are parallel processes, end quote, in Europe's reordering of the globe on its Judeo-Christian philosophical terms. From this perspective, Black diaspora studies is concerned with the remaking and the resignifying of the category of the human beyond the boundaries imposed on it in a post-1492 world. And world and after. Sorry, let me redo that. From this perspective, Black diaspora studies is concerned with the remaking and the resignifying of the category of the human beyond the boundaries imposed on it in a post-1492 world and after. And significantly, revisions have been made through and by a host of various political and cultural struggles in reorienting that European understanding of the world. The fundamental question and concern of Black diaspora studies, it seems to me, is to make sense, to analyze what the events of 1492 and the aftermath set in motion, and how various configurations of people have dealt with those events in a myriad of ways. Thus, it remains an enigma to me why so much of the Black diaspora debate has not seriously asked the question of why diaspora. In many respects, this is a question that concerns the politics of history and the ways in which such politics and histories can be mobilized for global justice. In this regard, historians of Atlantic history seem to have reached a crucially important place in their own debates, the recognition of how the global impact of the European expansion has reshaped the global Euro-Western terms. The ideas birthed in the context of the Atlantic world have been central to the ways in which European coloniality spread its global reach, and thus the ways in which many other diasporas have come into being. Limbaugh and Radiker's rather useful metaphor of the many-headed hydra is apt for thinking the historical and contemporary peregrinations of Euro-Western ordering of the globe post-1492. In this regard, capitalism as an organizing structure and new emergent ideas about humanness emerge and converge as the most salient examples of that reshaping, and Atlantic historians have been front and center in demonstrating the global historical reach and impact of both economy and culture, in fact, of how the two might indeed be one. So you can begin to hear my critique of the comparative diasporas thing that I think has been a bit of a canard. Instead, much of the noise in Black diaspora studies has been what some have come to see as too central a focus on the Atlantic world. In essence, a juggling for comparative equality of seas. Since the two decades publication of Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, the desire to displace the Atlantic as foundation to Black diaspora studies has been a constant in the debate. It seems to me that there's a fundamental misunderstanding at work in the debate. To insist upon the world-changing impact of the ongoing colonization of the Americas and transatlantic slavery as central to Black diaspora studies is neither to argue for exceptionalism nor to produce a singular grand narrative of modernity's birth. Since, as Sylvia Fisher writes, heterogeneity is a congenial condition of modernity. And that's a quote from Fisher. But Fisher further argues, and I want to quote her a little bit longer, if we do not take into account to what extent modernity is a product of the New World, to what extent the colonial experience shaped modernity in Europe and elsewhere, politically, economically, and aesthetically, and to what extent modernity is a heterogeneous, internally diverse, even contradictory phenomena that constituted and revolutionized itself in the process of transculturation, then obviously talk of modernity is just a reinstantiation of a Eurocentric particularism parading as universalism. I find in Fisher an important point of departure for thinking about 1492 and transatlantic slavery in the context of debates concerning diaspora, transnationalism, and settler colonialism. The departure concerns itself with the ways in which the Atlantic zone functions to put in place the mechanisms for the production of the resources, material, intellectual, and otherwise, for Europe to make its global play. Thus, a position like Fisher's runs counter to the kind of critique that has for so long been the mainstay of Black diaspora studies and the Atlantic refusal. Take, for example, Paul Seleza's critique of Paul Gilroy, in which he suggests that, quote, the studies of, and I'm quoting Seleza, quote, the studies of diaspora agency and originality are, quote, valorized. Zeleza correctly acknowledges that Gilroy's version is only one part of a complicated and entangled context that comes to be read as the whole. Zeleza falls, and which is not Gilroy's fault that people read his intervention as the whole. Zeleza faults what he calls cosmopolitan intellectuals for peddling such analyses, not mentioning that he too might be read within the group as a cosmopolitan intellectual, since he reports that he travels with, quote, a Canadian passport, resides in the US, and travels to Africa often, making him a member in what he terms the new or contemporary African diaspora. But even more importantly, it might have been useful to Zeliza's critique of Gilroy if he could have at least positioned African complicated complicity with the production of the New World, as Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother has so, in some ways, re-traumatizingly brilliantly done. As I have stated before in some other work, not all movement across borders makes a diaspora. And while it's particularly useful to make crucial distinctions about forms of migration and black being on which the ideas of anti-blackness have been invented, people, descendants of post-slavery black diaspora have no easy shores to return to. We die and live in the zone of the Americas, even when we're outside the zone of the Americas. It seems to me that part of what it means to speak of a black diaspora is to account for the ways in which the impossibility of return to an imagined or real homeland is always foreclosed and profoundly impossible. The impossibility is conditioned by the brutal dispersal, along with the severe cultural interruptions and the intervention of history that brought new attachments, subjectivities, and identifications into being or formation. At the same time, making belonging brutally and totally impossible. Thus, not all contemporary continental African migration might or can count as diasporic, even though a certain political logic requires it to be so, given the all-encompassing logics and practices of anti-black formations in the West. There's a qualitative difference between the now clear impossible return for let's say, many Somalis and some South Africans. Such claims are difficult evaluative ones to make, but taken within the rubric of cultural identity and the very materiality of the nation state as a point of return, making the evaluation is a useful one, even if it still has some unresolved fault lines in its conceptuality. The primary issue to consider, nonetheless, is how the long journey of Euro-Western dominance has impacted the complicated post-colonial politics set in motion through the events of the last 500 plus years, which continues to produce new subjects for the black diaspora out of a post-1492 and post-colonial Africa. Our debates have failed to adequately think these moments and conditions. I would suggest that much of the energy spent on trying to displace the Atlantic black diaspora is wrong-headed and could be better deployed engaging the foundational conditions which make the Atlantic the paradigmatic example, not the exceptional case. In this regard, too, we must not be sidetracked by linguistic differences. I'm not suggesting that language and regions are not important to these concerns, but what I'm trying to stress is that the Atlantic region, with its history of territorial theft, transatlantic slavery, and genocide, is the incubator of a set of conditions which we have inherited as a global situation organized on the basis of Euro-Western traditions of thought and the human, for which we must figure out how to extricate ourselves. A sober conversation about what that extrication means will account for political economy, cultural borrowing, sharing, mixing, and its outcomes and impacts, contradictory, antagonistic, and otherwise, and our entangled histories of power, knowledge, and land. The difficulty of this project belies the political stakes involved. In particular, the Americas and the African continent offer different and difficult focal points in this debate. Africa remains a difficult and troubling place for black diaspora identification. The story of Africa is a complex one for New World black peoples who make use of Africa as well as make Africa in numerous and different ways. The making of reparation with Africa and the New World is of particular importance here too. As Jamaica Kincaid has presently written about Caribbean peoples, they are a people who must make themselves native to a place they are not from. In the Ide is the genocide of the Taino, the genocide of the Caribs, and the brutal evidence of transatlantic slavery. Stacking Kincaid's claim next to the recent announcement, well, this was some years ago, I shouldn't say recent, But the Nigerian Minister of Culture apologizing for slavery complicates the picture. The public relations impact of such a story simultaneously limits the rupture and desire for a new world reconnection with Africa at the same time that it reinstates the foundational importance of transatlantic slavery to a black global body politic. But in the statement's discursive effects is the recognition of the ongoing traumas of transatlantic slavery on the continent and in the diaspora. All of this occurs in the context when yet another revival of Aboriginal resistance to the colonial condition is taking place in various spheres across the Americas from north to south. The consequences for diaspora studies not taking 1492 in transatlantic slavery serious are many. But since I have been mainly interested in addressing this argument to the institutional imperatives of knowledge producing in the university, I will begin to kind of move to a conclusion about it here. Everywhere these days, diaspora programs, centers, conferences, and seminars are springing up. I work at a university that has a diaspora studies program, but it's not a black diaspora studies program. In part, many of these circumstances are fueled by the older and newer migratory populations, forced, planned, and unplanned. In fact, if the post-1492 world bequeathed us anything, it has been the massive shifts in populations around the globe in its aftermath, the first such movement being transatlantic slavery in continuing sense. What I felt most in the debate on black diaspora conceptuality is its reluctance to grapple with the central claim of the European Enlightenment and modernity, to make a better human that is fundamentally always positioned against black being, and indeed is dependent upon logics of anti-blackness, which produce black beings as non-human. Grappling with that claim could prove useful and powerful for black diaspora studies, because it is in fact the various ways in which deployments of Western conceptions of the human function that continue to be the basis from which diasporic sensibilities, consciousness, and a potential politics might arise. In the case of New World blacks, the impossibility of any return imagined or real, even when individuals and groups physically return, means that the break that transatlantic slavery produced for some people who identify with Africa is an identification that can only be sutured through various and different kinds of performances of politics that place Africa within their discursive reach and imagination. Derek Walcott's divided tongue best captures the actual place of Africa when he asks rhetorically, choose between my English tongue and the Africa that I love. But he also furnishes that divided tongue or self with an insistence on a more hopeful self who has, quote, no nation but the imagination, allowing for a world citizenship that entangles, implicates, and complicates anew by refusing one of modernity's central inventions, the nation state. By so doing, Walcott offers a useful lens from which to make reparation with ongoing traumas of a world reconfigured on the basis of Euro-Western terms. Walcott seizes the moment to reside in the interstices of a Creole and thus evolving sensibility and reality, what we might call a new indigenism, or he at least points to indigeneity not as identity, but as process. A radical black diaspora studies might or should engage conversations concerning the Atlantic region seriously because the social and cultural revisions of the last 500 years have produced asymmetrical positions that allow for a kind of racial contract based on class and gender in which some black people enter a revised Euro-Western body politic. The same cannot actually be said for large masses of Aboriginal peoples, whom many still like to think of as extinct or in the past, especially in parts of the Caribbean. Black diaspora politics might be about something. It can how land, power, and knowledge have come together to enact and unfold one of the longest unbroken colonial periods in human history, and it might help to provide a better explanation of the past and the ways in which current conceptions of the present find their sustenance in the past, ideologically and otherwise. But it is nonetheless my argument that black diaspora studies takes us a long way towards refusing and offering better analyses of institutional and corporate multiculturalisms in our present moment, which mobilize difference as a commodity for corporate malfeasance. Malfeasance, yes. Additionally, it is a buttress against a post-colonial studies, a transnational global studies that refuses to complicate the tensions between old and new colonialisms and the ways in which empire, in its old and new forms, might be situated in a discontinuous continuum of Euro-Western ethno-domination. Significantly, diaspora sensibilities allow us to confront and engage the difficult and violent politics of modernity's invention of the nation state and its inability to produce a space for the full expression of human possibility. Indeed, the nation state provides ethno-cultural identities as the basis of an imagined care for the self that always seems to fall short of full human status and expression. Such insights position the North Atlantic Academy in a sphere of power for which our studies should attempt to mean something. It means not letting the university off the hook as a central link in global capitalism's domination in your Western guise, because ideas have been the central ingredient in the geopolitics of the globe in the past 500 years. In my view, a Black diaspora studies that begins with the European attempt to conquer the Americas and the inauguration of transatlantic slavery limits nothing, but it opens up avenues for a more honest global conversation to occur about what that expansion set in motion. Furthermore, such Black diaspora studies should not step away from the difficult debate of making life in a place where the ethics of arrival can be fashioned through the brutal test of Euro-Western dominance and Aboriginal claims to restore their stewardship of the lands. So Black diaspora studies modulates in between those two things. That is how my Black diaspora studies, taking the central transatlantic slavery's invention of Black beings, engage the further dynamics of Black ontologies in the Americas. So C.L.R. James, writing of the economics of lynching and its uneven geographies in the 1940s in the USA, in the 1940s as the USA prepared to join the war, pointing to the contradictions surrounding lynching. He analyzed that much lynching did not occur in places where white employers relied on Black labor because white employers wanted to protect their workforce, while in other places, lynching took place among the white working class who saw Black labor as a competitive threat to their economic and cultural prospects. Thus, in the latter areas, lynching was not only economic, but it was also cultural and racial bonding produced through the logics of post-Enlightenment and modern practices meant to render the Negro outside the national family as a group who could share the national resources. In this regard, think of Rosewood, of which John Singleton made a film of the same name that documents this history. Rosewood, a Black town community here in Florida, in which one of the most horrific stories of lynching, terrorism, and massacre of Black life took place. Rosewood was an autonomous Black community, but its white neighbors still felt it had to be kept in place as not so much economic competition, but as the force of white supremacist logics. James is clear that the state responded differently to these lynchings depending on what was at stake. In instances where labor was needed for the war effort, the state acted, but in areas where no such labor was needed, the state looked the other way or supported the actions of the white mobs. What James demonstrates is that the link between the economical and the cultural cannot be easily divvied up. Instead, what he wants us to acknowledge is the contradiction that lies at various settlements in time, and to account for the ways in which Black death is central to the very foundations of the modern state and capitalist formations, via what we might call plantational genocidal logics and practices. So taken together, I've been suggesting that the plantation and diaspora have produced new states of being for Black life forms. These states of being are fundamentally premised on practices of what Houston Baker called in the context of African American literature, the mastery of form and the defamation of form. It is precisely the manner in which Black life forms deform and reform not in the liberal democratic sense, reform in completely radical ways the foundational claims of post-Enlightenment modernity that Black people remain killable, By that I mean that black life is the residue of the failed and the flawed ideals of modernism that can only be possible through the denigration of black life itself, by placing black life outside the category of the human so that your American humanity can come into its own being. That the hoodies, the sagging pants, and rap music are states of black being in which the black life form are understood to be a dangerous threat is a significant articulation of present-future plantation logics. It extends drapetomania. Drapetomania was the supposed sickness that slaves suffered when they ran away from the plantation. It extends drapetomania into our present time. If the slave who sought to be free of the plantation suffered an illness that could only be cured through their mutilated body or flesh or their death, contemporary drapetomania writes the illness into and onto the hoodie, the sagging pants, and into black youth musical and other expressive choices in culture. Thus, black states of being in which black life seek to deform the very context of post-Enlightenment modernity to carve out spaces of life are used against them as the source to deny them any reach into European articulations of humanity. Much like drapetomania, the police are an extension of the patty rollers or patrol rollers, instituted to curtail the potentiality of black life forms, radically revising and thereby calling for a new account of what it means to be human. Indeed, policing and justice constitute an institutionality and knowledge form that is fundamentally organized in regards to prohibiting black life as human life. It is therefore not possible to reorient the Americas as a zone of life without first ending the Americas as a zone of black death. Let me repeat that. It is therefore not possible to reorient the Americas as a zone of life without first ending the Americas as a zone of black death. Any institution, knowledge, practice, or politics, all of which are entangled, that falls short of undoing the Americas, continues the endorsement of black death. Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Jonathan Farrell, Renisha McBride, thank you for your time and your patience. And I hope that was coherent enough. I hope that was coherent enough. Take your thing. I'm gonna sit here.
We have lots of time for questions and comments, and we do have a roaming mic as well at the back. So we can just settle in and settle out as people run off to other panels and places to go. But I think Ree at the back has the roaming mic.
Is that coherent?
Gemma.
Catherine, what not coherent? No, serious.
Thank you for your talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Could you kind of elaborate on this concept of a lost childhood? In my class on Black men and masculinities, I frequently talk about how Black boys, after the age of 5, are constructed as men, right, when they get enough height and their voice deepens. So can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah. I mean, for that, I am mainly drawing on Thelma King's book, Stolen Childhoods, which is I think Thelma King wrote that book in the mid to late 1990s, and it's a book, can you hear me? Okay, and it's a book that looks at the ways in which the production, the social code of what we call a childhood was entirely impossible for the young slave, because as soon as the young slave was able to participate in whatever activities that the master required, the slave was able to do so. But you can actually read a moment like this in, say, Frederick Douglass's narrative when he's struggling to figure out how he wants to learn to read and write. You see the fundamental social and political divide between him and the little white boys, whom he eventually tricks into teaching him how to read. But this idea is that So what you see is that the requirement of the slave child as both property and labor immediately takes away from that black life form any possibility of a childhood. Because one of the things that childhood, and we see post-emancipation and into emancipation, one of the things that childhood does is at least exempt from labor. So this is why we have such labor laws around child labor and so on and so forth. But also, children are also perceived as outside of the category of adults. And therefore, they're often not seen as threatening and so on and so forth in the ways that. But what we might call the black child is not given any of that. And in the post-emancipation, and what I would call the long emancipation, because we're still in emancipation, we're not free yet. In the long emancipation, we really see this most clearly in the idea that black children, regardless of age, are always somehow threatening and dangerous. But it's really Talma King's work and ideas in Stolen Childhood that I'm drawing on to think through this question.
Hi, I just wanted to say I'm also from the University of Toronto, so I really appreciate your comments about diaspora studies. Just a quick comment. You said something about Somalis and South Africans who cannot return, and I just wanted you to just elaborate a bit on that.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I was just using as an example the idea that it's one can make a kind of argument that it's impossible for Somalis to return to Somalia. But it's not necessarily impossible for South Africans to return to South Africa, because the two nation states, in some ways Somalia is what we call a failed state. We're not talking about Somaliland. And so just evaluatively, then for me, there's a particular kind of conception of political problem when we talk about a new African diaspora and put all of these people into the same category. Because what happens is that it takes away from the specific contours of what somebody like myself would argue, that the post-slave, the descendants of those people of transatlantic slavery constitute a particular kind of diaspora. And that in taking that notion seriously, that there's much at stake then in simply throwing everybody into this one thing called the black diaspora. Yet at the same time, all of those Africans who entered the zone of the Americas post-emancipation also are conditioned by the death-dealing qualities of blackness, whether they recognize it as such or not. So it's a complicated picture, but the reason I'm raising it and pushing it a little bit is to get us to figure out what's exactly at stake in claiming diaspora as a space from which to do political work.
Thank you, Rinaldo, for a great talk. I'm very excited that you're here. And I had two questions for you. One is whether diaspora is, it just seems like a concept that's so easily enrolled in projects of, regressive nation building and conservative projects of identity, and whether what you're suggesting is that it should be, as a concept, somehow opened up to new kind of forms, or whether it doesn't make sense to talk a little bit about doing away with, or just sort of negating the concept in a way, because it seems so easily co-opted, to put it simply. And then I had a second question, if you don't mind, which is sort of doing a bit of work on CARICOM's new committee, regional committee on reparations, and if you could talk a little bit about whether, and I know that this is a long-term project, but let's say it's taking on a new form in the context of massive debt default in the Caribbean, and whether there's any hope in that, whether a reparations movement again and again might do something to create other zones of life and possibility in the Americas.
Those are two great questions. I think the first one, it's exactly because I think that the ways in which some contemporary institutions have responded to the idea of diaspora as though it is actually easy to appropriate is not the case. I actually think diaspora is a really difficult thing to appropriate. And so part of my own kind of pushback here, and even in the example around using Somalis, is to kind of, if one might, reopen the possibility of what we used to call Pan-African conversations, that in a particular moment, we stop using that language and use the language of diaspora. But the language of diaspora and Pan-Africanism and a particular kind of beyond the nation state forms of Black global identification remain crucial. And in fact, we see this being played out in the attempts around reparation, because it's not simply that these Anglo-Caribbean nations are making these particular claims at this historical moment. But it's very interesting to watch how African-American intellectuals have responded to those claims. For me, the question of reparations is always an impoverished question and debate if it doesn't take up the other thing that I was trying to say. If it doesn't bring to the conversation the question of Aboriginal genocide and near genocide, then it misses a significant component of what the claim might be about. So I think it's a wonderfully politically strategic moment for the Anglo-Caribbean to make this claim and to make it as a kind of global claim. So I like that it's not just positioned via in relationship to England, to Britain, but that it involves other Europeans who benefited from the proceeds and the avails of transatlantic slavery and the theft of other people's lands and their minerals and resources. But I do think that the question of diaspora is something that we have to struggle over, and that we can't give it away to institutions as a way of producing forms of identity, because diaspora is this wild, messy, crazy thing. It's not something that is easily solvable. And in fact, diasporas exist, and the logic of diaspora is constantly about calling into question the limits of the nation state. And the ways in which nation state belong in just does not work for the descendant of the Black transatlantic slave subject. So that's what I'm trying to work out.
Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to ask you, I was trying to dovetail on your first question, because I wanted to find out whether or not you thought about the stolen childhood as a survival mechanism of Black death. And the reason that I'm asking you that is I'm Queen Quet, I'm chiefess of the Gullah Geechee Nation. So within the context of living within the Gullah Geechee Nation, we have people that live to be 100 and something years old. So we tell people, let a child be a child. However, we have those who've migrated to urban areas. They don't think they're going to live that long. So they need to parentify their children in case they die, so that their children can survive. So have you looked at that context and also the juxtaposition of lifestyles given certain circumstances that create more of an incline, so we say, I'm a mathematician too, in this chart in regard to Black death?
That's a really difficult question. But what I would say that, and I'm hinting now, and I'm really free associating, but what you just said about Gullah culture, you know, there are aspects of a kind of pre-urban Anglo-Caribbean culture where similar kinds of vernaculars exist about letting a child be a child. Let me speak before my thoughts. But I think that is actually a reference back to the fact that slavery did not allow for childhood, right? So that vernacular move is about the recognition of what used to be, of what Talma King calls stolen childhoods. And so in those communities where the kind of effective sensation of self is in some ways much more closely tied to some notion of an African self, I think that that's part of a form of self-making. What I'm saying though is, using Catherine's work about space and time out of plantation, that this kind of stolen notion of a childhood extends beyond the formal plantation into our contemporary settlement, where whether one is now in the rural or the urban, the encounters with the institutions that come out of the foundationality and the institutionality of the Americas, whether it's policing, schools, or what have you. So even schools, where we think are spaces where childhood should be able to happen, it doesn't happen for black children, even within that context. So this is the problem that we have to live with and that we have to undo, which means undoing all of the institutions of the Americas, of the modern world, really. Because they're premised on the death of black, of the black figure.
Hi, Rinaldo. I just wanted to ask you if you could say something about the place of gender and sexuality in Black diaspora studies.
Oh, that's a tough question. You know, a lot of my work is on gender and queer stuff. And yeah, so how would I answer that now? You know, okay, I'll answer it this way. The more that I grapple with the foundation institutionalities of post-enlightenment and modernity, I've found that the work that I do in queer studies and gender studies has interestingly become less important. And it's because of the ways in which the categories of modernity configure what Sylvia Wynter called these genres of human, in which at every instance, black personhood has to struggle to enter them, right? So if you look at contemporary post-60s politics, Catherine began with the 60s, you know, if woman becomes the category for which liberation is seek, black women have to make an argument to enter that category. If we come to our contemporary moment, if trans identity is the most radical identity that points to the limits of the promise of freedom, black people have to make the argument to enter that category. So I've found myself stepping back and trying to think about what are the ways in which, and the shapes and the contours of these ideas and ideals and possibilities that come out of modernity and post-enlightenment settlement that black people never fit. And why is that? So this is why I'm going back to the scene of the crime, which is transatlantic slavery, to kind of think forward into the present. So it's not that the way in which I would have answered that question 5 years ago would have been to say, you know, in some ways that, you know, black queers are excluded from diaspora politics, and here's some ways in which we intervene, which was a lot of work that I did. And now I'm not even so much sure that that's a useful way of approaching the question anymore, because the scene of the crime already sets up the terms of the debate in ways that limit the intervention, so to speak. Doesn't mean that people shouldn't do that work nonetheless, right? Doesn't mean that we can't still say that there are ways in which a lot of black diaspora work is deeply masculinist and imagines nations or the potential of nations in particular ways and so on. It doesn't mean that that kind of critique is no longer necessary and warranted. But for myself now, there's a kind of step back because I want to intervene into a logic of post-enlightenment and post-enlightenment modernity that configures the black subject or non-subject in a way in which to actually begin to think concisely about the ideals of modernity is to want to open up the entire thing. Are we at our time to end?
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for your questions. And remember that there is food and drink to be had right now until about 8 o'clock or maybe longer. So please join us for a reception. Thank you, Rinaldo.